Welcome to this month's Pigments 101 webinar. We're very happy to have you all here, and we would like to continue our webinar series. And this month, obviously, is going to be a more application specific, where we're going to talk about colorants for inks. And as we've done in the past, this will be recorded, and the link to the recording as well as the PDF of the presentation will be sent to all those that are in attendance today. And if you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat function here on Teams, and I'll address all of those questions at the end of the presentation. And lastly, as we always continue to try to improve the quality of our presentations, we would like to get your feedback. And so when I send out the recording and the presentation, I will also be sending a link to a quick 5-minute SurveyMonkey with a few brief questions just to get some of your feedback inputted, as we always want to continue to hear your feedback and make those improvements. So without further ado, we'd like to go ahead and get started. So welcome to the colorful world of printing inks. It's an amazing area. I kind of grew up, if you will, in the coatings area, and I've always been fascinated with ink. And the technology that goes into creating the color that you can with ink itself. And so the color gamuts are wide and vary, either by the actual colorants themselves or by the technology that go behind and the programming behind the printing itself to create those colors. As far as a market overview, this is just a source from it's based out of 2012, so it's old data, but it gives a little bit of a feel for where a little bit more mature marketplaces are versus some of the more emerging marketplaces are for inks. So we've all got that desktop printer and even some photo printers in our homes and offices, wide format, see them all over the place on the roadways. Some of the more emerging markets are in the packaging area, as well as textiles, and maybe even some industrial decor area. So as far as pigment classification and colorants for inks, it's really pretty much everything is used, whether it be pigments or dyes. Both inorganic and organic pigments are used, all the way from colored and white inorganic with the TiO2, micas are used, aluminums are used, so pretty much every type of colorant is used in one way or another in the inks area. From Sudarshan's perspective, the main areas that we focus on for inks are out of the high performance pigments, as well as the classical or azo pigments, the CPC blues and greens, as well as mica effect pigments for those applications that require that. In addition, we also have solvent dyes, CICPs. Pretty much those are not used in the ink industry, but there's always that possibility to bring those in for a specific purpose. So as part of taking a look at pigments, it's always good to refresh ourselves with the classical versus high performance pigments. And for the inks marketplaces, the key areas are to understand what kind of light fastness to solvents, or resistance to chemicals are required for that particular application. And so there might be a choice of the classical type of azo pigment, or your application might require to move to a high performance pigment for that particular area. So colorants, of course, are going to provide that visual stimulation. They're going to attract the consumer. They will deliver a message, and that message is, buy me, pick me off the shelf. And then also they enhance any kind of brand image that you're trying to convey with your product. The colorant selection process, obviously the color and effect that you're looking for is first and foremost. Will that be the CMYK or a spot color? Do you need an effect pigment like a mica or an aluminum for your color? Next is application. What kind of substrate do you need to print on? What type of resin system is required? Will there potentially be any interactions in the formulation that you have? What type of application is it? Is it going to be indoor or outdoor? So do you have to consider what kind of light fastness or weather fastness that you might require with that ink formulation? And of course, then there's compliance. So if you do have compliance needs, are there food contact requirements that you have, toy, medical? There's a number of those that have to be considered when selecting a colorant. Cost and value. Obviously, cost is the actual dollar per pound of that particular colorant. But there's also that value in use that we've talked about in the past, where you may get additional value, whether that be from a strength perspective, from a technical property perspective, that might be of more interest for a higher price per pound. Then also the performance has to be considered. What kind of transparency do you need? What kind of flow and viscosity do you need? Gloss is always important. Acid and alkali resistance is important. Heat stability, not as important as in other areas. However, in some ink applications, the ink formulation and obviously the colorant will see some intense heat for a very short period of time. And so there's something to potentially consider in selection of that colorant. Migration. Strength, of course, print density, fineness of grind, as well as tack. So I've used this slide in the past, and it's very valid in every application. You need to be able to balance the pigment's performance as well as the application performance. And as you're putting together a formulation, you're always going to have that checklist of your musts, wants, and nice to haves. And so it's that balance to be able to fill out that checklist as best as possible for the colorant selection. We've talked about pigment synthesis in the past, and just a little reminder that about 75 to 80% of the pigment performance is always going to come from that actual chemistry of the pigment. The remaining 20 to 25% of the performance then comes from the specific finishing or surface treatments that are used to direct that product to the end property or end application. So we've talked about finishing in the past. That finishing could include a surface treatment or other additive once the crystal has been synthesized in the reactor. Other finishing steps include what type of drying process is being used, what kind of milling is being used, or if a milling process is actually used at all. And then lastly, in the blending step, where individual batches are blended into a lot, there might be other additives that are added at that step, depending on the specific application requirement for that particular pigment. So when we talk about pigments for inks, there are, as we saw in that market overview slide, there are many application requirements as well as formulations required for ink applications. And because of that, there's also going to be quite a variety of ink form or pigment for inks formulated for those different types of formulations. So there's a wide variety of additives used, surface treatments, all of the drying methods are used, and pretty much all of the different milling techniques are being used to be able to meet all of those needs. However, it's not to say that you have to stay in that ink, pigments for ink bailiwick in there. So there's going to be pigments for plastics, pigments for coatings that have been developed, and they may offer something specific for your particular need. They will work, definitely there. They will work, and they potentially will offer something different to your in your formulation that might prove to be beneficial for your needs. So I always encourage people to not to discount a pigment if it's part of a coatings grade or part of a plastics grade, because it might bring you something that you didn't know you could get with that particular pigment. And so, for example, I have some data here for Pigment Red 122 in an ink formulation, NC ink formulation, and I'm comparing all three types of Pigment Red 122s. So we've got a number of ink developed products as well as coatings developed products, and another in the plastics area. The chart is the dispersion, viscosity, as well as gloss in here. So you can see that there are a couple of different products that are on the low end, one from the ink category, one from the coatings category in viscosity. And then a bulk of them are on a little bit on the higher end. And then in the gloss area, the bulk of the products tend to fall into about a 10 unit difference between them. However, we have one product that was developed for our inkjet area that has quite a high gloss in there. So depending on your need, you might choose to go outside the ink area and select something else. Following up as far as color, so the finishing step will always adjust that color depending on how it is used. So in this same NC ink formulation, I'm giving you the full tone color of that dispersion, the A versus the B value. And so you can see that the red-green of these selection of products range have about a 10 unit difference in terms of the red-green value, with a coatings product being the reddest, while one of the ink products being the greenest. And then similarly with the yellow-blue, a nice about a 15 unit difference between the yellowness and the blueness. So depending on where you need to be from a color rise, it may be a different selection. And then lastly, in the red 122 area, these are the tint tone L values, so it gives a measure of the strength. And for the bulk of them, they're all in the same ballpark with respect to this value. However, there is one ink and one coatings product which do show a higher strength value than the others. So depending on what you're looking for, you may choose to go outside the traditional ink pigment selection box. And then similarly, in taking a look at some Pigment Red 53-1s in the same NC ink formulation, again, we're looking at viscosity and gloss of the dispersion. In this particular case, we're looking at a couple of plastics grades and some ink grade Red 53-1s. And again, a nice wide variety of viscosities here, with a plastics grade providing the lowest viscosity, and one of the ink grades is at the higher end. And again, the gloss also varies as well, depending on what your needs are. And then similarly, the color is also very different depending on what products we are taking a look at in this same formulation. And then lastly, I've brought you some data on yellow 151. It's not a big use in ink areas, but I did want to show that although we don't have a specific ink grade, we have evaluated these in this NC ink formulation. So we've got a plastics grade and a coatings grade, same type of data with the gloss and the viscosity. Not a huge difference between the two products, but it's always going to be there. And then, of course, the mass tone the mass tone color of the dispersion as well for these two particular products. So again, I always go back to that that adage that there are many types of pigments out there. They're going to work in some way or not. So why not choose the actual product that gets what properties you are looking for? So as far as ink is concerned, I'm not saying anything that you don't already know, but it's a combination of pigment resins and solvents and additives that are brought together to create either a fluid or a paste that is capable of printing. So obviously the pigment imparts the color and transparency of that particular formulation. The varnish, a terminology particularly used in the ink area, typically is a mixture of the resin and solvent that works as the binder to bring all of that together in the ink formulation. Solvent is used to adjust for viscosity as well as enabling the transfer, and it also impacts the drying speed as well. And then there's a whole host of additives that imparts very specific properties to that ink. They can address the drying, the UV stability, surfactants for flow, and all kinds of other properties that you can use an additive for. We so lovingly call them snake oils because a lot of times they're very unique in what they do for the actual finished properties. So as far as ink is concerned, there's two basic categories, paste ink and liquid ink. From their names, you can guess that the paste ink is very, more of a thick area, whereas the liquid inks are going to be flowable. And so I'm not going to spend time here on going through all the different types of formulations here, but just suffice it to say that there's quite a bit of variety in the ink area in both the liquid and the paste ink areas. And so for those of you who might not be as familiar with some of the ink area, as we do have a number of folks that are joining us from coatings and plastics, I offer up a little bit of background on ink. So a print process such as offset or metal decorative make sure that or provides that the image is on the same plane as the substrate. The flexography or letterpress, the image is going to be raised, gravure, where the image is formed below the surface of the substrate. And of course, we all know screen printing, where the ink is pressed through the screen and forced onto the substrate. So creating color through printing, as I said earlier, this is always a fascinating thing for me because we've all heard the CMYK and how that can go in and make all these wonderful colors just with 4 colorants. And then you throw in maybe some spot colors as well, and you can really get some very interesting and very vivid colors from there. So for ink forming, so if you take that lovely butterfly wing and break it down into its finest pixels, you can start to begin to see how the ink is laid down, one drop on top of another drop, to be able to create that specific color of that specific pixel. So ink manufacturing is pretty basic. The varnish is brought together, and then that varnish is then mixed with the colorant in a premix type. and then the grinding is taken care of. So the paste inks are typically done maybe 3-roll mill, 2-roll mill type of dispersion process, where the liquid inks might be using a medium mill type of a process to be able to grind that pigment down to where it needs to be. And then the dispersion is diluted down with additional varnish and set up for packaging. So as far as testing of colorants for inks, we at Sudarshan are very focused to make sure that we develop, create and develop the inks that are required for specific areas in there. So viscosity and flow is probably one of the key areas that are good, that are important for ink areas. But there's a lot of impact items that impact that particular property. First is obviously the pigment and resin interaction. So they have to be matched up to be properly and optimally dispersed. Moisture is always a concern, and moisture comes in both in solvents and in pigments. So as a pigment manufacturer, we need to understand what the tolerance of the moisture in the pigment can be. As you can imagine, the pigment manufacturing process is a wet process, so there's always going to be moisture around that pigment. And so during the drying step, we need to know what that maximum amount can be for that particular pigment. Pigment to pigment interactions, and really this should be more of a dispersion category here, because you might have pigment A that's optimally dispersed with a specific dispersant, and pigment B might be dispersed with a different dispersant. And when you bring those two together, either in a combined ink formulation or potentially at the printing step, the dispersant on pigment A might like pigment B better, and potentially come off of one pigment onto the other, causing some instability or some flocculation that can interfere with both viscosity or color or transparency there. That's always an important area to consider when you're bringing different types of pigments together. Ink formulation, of course, what kind of solvents are being used. Additives, as I mentioned earlier, there are many, and they're very specific. So there might potentially be some incompatibility of additives when they come together with the remaining items in that formulation. And then, of course, temperature is always a key. So from a pigment perspective, we take a close look at the moisture, as I mentioned, and that particular test method is named souring, where we essentially check the effect of the moisture of that ink formulation. So we have a couple of resin systems that we take a look at, and where we purposely add different levels of water to that final ink, and the viscosity, color, opacity, and gloss is checked initial and after our week of stability to make sure that the water that is added it will be okay to that particular formulation. Transparency, of course, is always key, or opacity, depending on your need. So that really is obviously the type of printing and printing requirements. From a testing perspective, traditionally these are assessed visually against a standard with a numbering rating system, where if it's equal to the standard, you'll see a 0, or if it's got a positive number, that usually will indicate that it is more opaque, with a higher the number indicating the higher the opacity. And then conversely, if it's a negative number, it indicates that the material is more transparent. Again, the higher the number, the more transparent. But it can also be measured for those who like numbers versus a visual value by measuring the L value over a black and white card. So the higher the number, the higher the opacity of that particular material. Migration, very important if your application has food contact. And here we take a look at a printed nylon film, which is sandwiched between two unprinted nylon films and is held that way for 30 minutes. And then we observe if there's any migration of that ink onto the unprinted films in there. Density, of course, that's a measure of how well the printing is received onto the substrate, and so it's always important to be able to get that appropriate density for the application need. Gloss is an obvious one. It's a very much one of the first things your eye catches with respect to the printed image. So it's always important to be able to know what kind of gloss that you need. Typically, they are measured at 20, 60, and 85 degrees. So depending on what your final application is, that might be something of need there. So if you're looking at a billboard from your car window, you'll have a different requirement from a gloss angle versus looking at something directly in front of your eyes on your desk. Fineness of bride, of course, is always very key when you're talking about a dispersion. So we want to make sure we optimize that dispersion to get to the best dispersion properties that we can. So fineness is one way to make that assessment. Another is looking under a microscope, but I'm not a huge fan of that, primarily because it's a much more limited segment of that particular quality assessment. And is also very subjective in nature. Resolubility is very important. If you recall, I mentioned that the pixels, the ink drops are piled on top of each other to get the final color. So that resolubility is important to be able to get the appropriate color that has been programmed. So in this case, we take a look at using the solvent that's in the ink formulation, place it on top of the printed ink to assess how much of that ink comes off to designate the resolubility. Not so much a colorant property as much as it is a resin property. Soap resistance, as the name implies, if your if your ink needs to be in contact with any kind of alkali substrates, this is an important property. Here, a soap jelly is prepared and strips of printed ink are placed on top for a 24-hour period, and then once they're removed, we look for any kind of staining on that soap jelly. So there's all kinds of problems that can occur during printing, and I'm not going to go through them all, but I really wanted to focus on those where a colorant could be the problem when you're doing your investigation when you have a problem. So here, obviously, shade variation is directly related to the colorant. This could be internal, where there could be a misadd of some sort, but with respect to a colorant, the particular lot of pigment might be at an outside edge of specification, or at a different place within the specification if there's some kind of hiccup in the process. Fading, obviously, it can also be due to the pigment, and this might be the choice of the chemistry of pigment. So maybe an improper selection of chemistry in the application resulted in a fading of the color. Jelly, I talked about that with the moisture content, so that could be based off of the a high content in the pigment. Back impression also could be due towards the pigment as well. Cell blocking could be due to the undergrinding of pigments, of the pigment itself, where it could be blocking the exit of that particular printing process. And delamination also could be a result of the pigment, where potentially the interaction between the pigment surface, whether that's treated or not, and the resins that are in the system are incompatible, and there's delamination that occurs. So as far as future developments for colorants, the industry is mature, and we don't expect any new chromophores to be developed in the near future. We always try to put a high priority to lower our costs so that we can pass that along to you as much as we can. As far as properties are concerned, we are always looking to help improve that dispersion of that pigment or colorant. As far as other properties are concerned, we are always looking to also see how we can continue to push some of the technical properties like stability, durability, and strength. And from the hue perspective, we do continue to try to push those envelopes as well, especially in the red, orange, and yellow areas. And as always, we always like to listen to all of you out there to make sure if there is something that we've missed or some other subpar technical properties, we want to hear about it, and we want to try to see if we can improve upon those. And then, of course, we're always continuing to make sure that we are meeting all of the global government regulations that are out there. These continue to change with time, and we want to make sure that we're on the forefront and making sure that we have products that meet everybody's needs based on these regulations. And then lastly, one thing that we do like to pride ourselves on is that on occasion we do tailor colorants to meet a specific application needs. Obviously, that has to do with making sure that we meet making it a smart business decision as well, but we've done that in the past. We're nimble enough that we can be able to do this. So just a little bit of a then and now kind of a scenario is something that I'm very proud of Sudarshan. In 2018, I pulled this slide from an older presentation, obviously, so you can see where we've been in some of the brand areas and chemistry areas in our organization. And then fast forward to 2022, things have changed quite a bit. In our Sudaperm high performance area, we've expanded the existing products with new products in each of these chemistries, and we've added new chemistries like our recent addition of Violet 23 and Yellow 138 to the brand. Also new chemistries in our classic areas. We've added Pigment Yellow 174 to that area, as well as additional products within the current ones. And then we've also added new brands. We've added a Sudajet brand focusing on the needs of inkjet applications. And of course, as I mentioned, we have a line of solvent dyes and a line of CICPs in here. And then our effect areas continue to expand always as we try to create new and unique color spaces for the marketplaces. So our next in our series, we are going to revisit the mica effect pigments, but in this case, we're going to take a little bit more of a deep dive in how we develop a mica effect pigment, and then how do we design with mica effect pigments. So stay tuned for that. That'll be held on April 22nd or 26th, I'm sorry. and you'll receive that invitation about a week prior to the webinar. And then in our future series, we will also revisit some CPC blues with some additional detail on those as well. So I am just one part of our North American team. We are all here to answer and help you in any way. So please feel free to reach out to any one of us with any questions or needs that you might have. We're all here to help. And lastly, I'm not going to go through them all here, but I did attach to the presentation in each color space all of the Sudarshan products that I think are appropriate for ink applications. So when you receive the PDF of the presentation, just take a look at these last few pages and let us know if there's something there that you have questions on or how we can help. And lastly, I'd just like to open it up for any questions that you might have at this point. And let me take a look at if there's any questions here. Okay, I don't see any questions. However, if you do have any questions after this, or as you've reviewed the recording or the presentations, please let us know. And as I mentioned, you will also be receiving a link to the with a quick survey that we would appreciate if you can provide some feedback. Oh, we did get some question here is what is the best way to get FDA status of a particular pigment? So that would be really just to connect with us and we will get you the proper certificate needed for that particular pigment. So we will provide that for you each time, because that changes a lot over the time. So we want to make sure that we get you the most accurate aspect of it. I've got a comment here, which I'm unsure of. It's something for interior use in here. So I'm unsure of what the question there is in there. So if you have something specific, then feel free to connect with me. All right. I don't see any additional questions. So at that point, I really do appreciate you joining us today. And yep, one more question here. Is there overlap for pigments that can be used in inks and paints? Absolutely. And that is why I did bring you the data there in some of the formulations that we've used. And then likewise, going on to the paint side, we've done a lot of work taking a look at how ink and plastic pigments perform in coatings as well. So we do have that information and we can help guide you as well. All right. Again, I want to thank you for joining us and we look forward to seeing you next month. Take care, everybody.